warm welcome to Federal's special program, Capital Beat. Consumer Price Index, that is CPI based inflation, reached a 14-month high of 6.21% in October, which is up from 5.49% in September, which is indicating persistent price pressures across the sectors. Now, the data shows higher inflation in rural areas, which is at 6.68% compared to 5.62% in the urban regions. Now, the food inflation, it remains higher in October, which is at 10.87%, which is driven largely by the rising prices of vegetables, fruits, oils, and fats. And in September, the food inflation stood at 9.24%. Now, the rural areas have experienced a higher inflation as compared to the urban areas. Now, there is also a rise in housing and electricity costs. Then, if you talk about the industrial output, that shows a growth of 3.1%. And in August, the industrial output had contracted for the first time in nearly 2 years. So, the big question we are asking, what is the reason for this high inflation? And how can the government really control it? And why has the government not been able to control it? We'll try and understand all of this. Joining me now is renowned economist of the country, Santosh Mehrotra. So thank you so much for joining on the Federal. And my first question, that a record 14-month high inflation, what does one make of it? And couldn't the government have corrected this anomaly?
Well, what is driving it is food inflation, and food accounts for nearly half of the basket, which constitutes the full basket for calculating the consumer price index. So, the important and interesting thing is that uh, this government, in its has had the audacity to keep uh, prices of diesel and petrol, which are a significant input, meaning fuel prices have also been held up, kept up by the high tax rate that the central government levies, the excise duties that it levies. Of course, the states also contribute to those taxes, but the point is the central government is a much bigger contributor. So the consistent reason and underlying reason that inflation and food inflation in particular is not coming down is that the government seems completely hell-bent upon keeping oil prices, fuel prices high, despite the fact that international oil prices have fallen. Under the circumstances when there is a continuous pressure from below of in terms of input costs for transporters of food, and also to some extent, of course, the point is that the government has also been attempting to cut down on fertilizer subsidies. So that's an additional reason. A third reason has been that we've seen that the rain was variable, but that's not so surprising. We can anticipate this sort of thing. So the rain continued for a significant period of September. So it is in September that we've seen these.
Interrupt you, Mr. Mehrotra, that you spoke about the rain. Now, this is something which is an annual feature. And to what extent is the current inflationary pressure driven by seasonal factors like the weather, and how can it be attributed to the structural economic challenges?
No, the structural challenges in some ways I have already referred to. And the seasonal rain does impact the output and therefore the availability of food prices. You see, we have to recall that the overall inflation rate has risen by about 6.5%. But the food inflation rate is nearly 40 to 50% higher than that. And food prices are impacted directly by the rain. This is what I'm hinting at. That's really what I'm trying to say. Because as I began by saying, the food prices, food will account for nearly half of the total price, total rise in prices, because the weight of the in the basket of consumer products of food items is nearly half. It is still about 45, 46%. It has fallen slightly compared to 10 years ago, but it's not fallen very much. So that's the reason why I'm driving home the point about food. And there's an additional reason, Neelu, why I'm driving home the point about food, is that during COVID, we have seen that it was really food inflation which was driving it. Because fuel prices, the international oil prices had tended to fall. They had risen, after the Israel war broke out, but before that it had risen on account of disruption in international oil market caused by the 2.5-year-old Ukraine-Russia war, which had led to the United States imposing sanctions upon Russia, and Russia is a major supplier. This was happening in the context that Iran was already under sanctions. So we had a crisis ongoing, which has been now exacerbated by these partly seasonal and partly structural factors. Um, so let me stop there, because I mean, in some ways, I've already hinted at what the government could do. It could have done many things to relieve the pain and the stress upon the population, because the government can claim, look, we are giving free rations to 800 million people, but we can come back to that. The point is, that's only rice or wheat. That's all. It's
Right.
nothing else.
So, but
And people
since
eat more than that. Yeah.
absolutely. No, but since you were talking about many factors and how the government could have control but has not been able to control, but I want to come to the global economic trends. Now, say, for example, a strong US dollar and commodity price fluctuations, how much of those factors really contribute to the inflation in India? Do you think that they are very strong and potential factors?
To some extent, yes, because we are a major importer of oil, and we know that the strong dollar means that the rupee has depreciated. The rupee is now at 84 rupees to a dollar plus. Now, so obviously we are paying more, and the uh, the current government, the current central government, has been adjusting domestic prices in accordance with international prices. And the argument can well be given that, actual international oil prices were consistently much higher for about 8 or 10 years until 2014. And this government benefited hugely from a windfall gain for the first 7 odd years of its governance. After it came to power in mid 2014, by the end of 2014, international oil prices fell. So there was a windfall gain in the sense that this government experienced, because while it was paying, the RBI was paying and to the international market or oil much less than was being paid by the government earlier, because you know, but the price of petrol and diesel remained high. So, in other words, the benefit all flowed to the government, meaning it did not subsidize because if it really believed in its, you know, the domestic price, in the principle that domestic prices are going to be impacted by international price adjustments, and the international price had fallen, so they should have reduced the domestic price. They didn't do that. They just took advantage of that because they had to give less of a subsidy. Now the the gain to the consolidated fund of India by the reduction in subsidy on account of fertilizer subsidy coming down, because fertilizer is also oil based, gas based, and the fuel subsidy. So for those were gains. Now, how did the government use that money? It spent it on massive amount of handouts.
Hmm.
What this government itself calls freebies. Lots of cash transfers. All of that it has been doing, including, of course, the PM
But
Kisan.
all
And
these schemes, these welfare schemes like the Ladli Behna Yojana and wherever these poll-bound states,
this is
these Ladli
recent.
Behna. So does that also have an impact on this rising inflation?
No, I mean, the government would claim that actually this is to ease the burden.
Hmm.
And they're right in saying that. Because till about 2 years ago, only three state governments had cash transfers. This is in addition to the PM Kisan. Okay. The PM Kisan has been around since early 2019, late 2018, you recall. The cash transfer to owner cultivators in rural areas of 6,000 rupees per annum. After that, the pattern set in where about 2 years ago there were only three governments which were giving these kind of cash transfers. Today there are 10 governments or 10 more governments which have been giving these cash transfers. Every state which is about to have a state election is starting to do that, including the Congress. They've learnt the game from the BJP.
Right.
So we don't know who to blame here. But the point really is something more foundational than all of what we have so far mentioned.
Hmm.
What is that? It's not as though prices were not rising under the UPA from 2005, 6 onwards, till all the way till about 14. They were rising. However, the important point is because non-farm jobs were growing rapidly, and workers were being pulled out of agriculture, the labor market had tightened, so real wages were rising. Nominal wages were rising so fast that they were rising faster than the rate of inflation, which was higher then than it has been in the last 2 or 3 years also.
Right.
So it is true that this government benefited from the fall in international oil prices for 7 years. Therefore, the inflation rate under this government was low. But Neelu, this is the important point. Because of the failure of this government in generating jobs, the people are feeling the pinch very severely, because what we've seen is that because non-farm jobs are not growing and the young are joining the labor force, the real wages have flattened out. They're constant. They're
Right.
not rising. Now, under those circumstances, if prices rise as they have in the last 3 years, right? They were not rising in the first 7 years. It is true of this government. But if they've risen in the last 3 or 4 years, whatever may be the reason, it is incumbent upon an existing government, an incumbent government, to actually relieve the stress on the poor. Because to some extent the middle class, because the middle class would benefit hugely if petrol and diesel prices were reduced. But the pressure on the poor is unrelenting. It is unrelenting.
No, but
And
then right. But what you're explaining, and that brings us to the question that how will the government then manage this kind of in inflation, and that too
Right,
without hampering economic growth.
right. So the way to do this, and people like me have been saying this for a long time, that instead of giving out a lot of handouts, what you attempt to do is to move towards an industrial policy which actually generates jobs. If you create non-farm jobs, then many things will follow. People's incomes would rise. People's incomes, because they've not been rising because jobs are not growing. What have millions of people done? In the last 4 years, they have gone back to agriculture. They've gone back to farming. Now, what does that mean? If Nilu, 80 million workers were added to agriculture in the last 4 years, that's a catastrophic situation for rural areas. So when you were saying inflation is high in rural areas,
Yes.
now imagine a situation where 80 million workers have been added to agriculture in the last 4 years. They are eking out an existence on a already small plot of land, or they're trying to, or they've gone back and some of them have opened a little shop. Their children have been pulled out of school, partly because for 2 years during COVID, schools were closed, and parents pulled children out of private schools and put them into government schools because they can't afford to pay the fees, Baba. So we've got a crisis in the education sector, and we've got a crisis in the economy, as a result of which we are seeing the stress within the population growing. So you were asking karna kya hai? Firstly, cut the taxes of the central government. If the central government cut taxes on petrol and diesel, it will reduce the inflation rate downstream, because diesel and petrol is an input into a whole series of products, including food items. The transportation of food items depends upon having diesel in your truck. So if the central government was willing to do that, and it has not been willing to do that for the last 3 years, that's what is unbelievable and tragic.
No,
Why
but
is
Mr.
it not? You have
Mehrotra,
to understand why. No, you have to first let me explain for the benefit of your listeners. Why is it not willing to do that? Because it is desperate for funds so that it can distribute it as freebies. And why is it desperate for funds? Because on the one hand, it doesn't want to increase its borrowings because it has to consolidate the the fiscal deficit, cannot allow the fiscal deficit to rise, and it has cut corporate tax rate. In the middle of 2019, 5 years ago, it cut corporate tax rate. So कहीं से तो और पैसे बनाने हैं ना. So this is a
no,
firm,
this is
certain
right.
source of income.
But Mr. Mehrotra, this is a case of a persistent inflation where
Yes,
it's almost like a persistent inflation we see. But the
yes,
thing is, that how will this persistent inflation impact the consumer confidence and also the business investment decisions?
yes. So the business investors are not investing, because why else do you think you have a situation where the only the government has increased its public infrastructure investment and the private sector is not coming in? Because capacity utilization is low in the manufacturing sector. If capacity utilization is low, why will new investment come in? I mean, and
True.
as you rightly said, consumer demand is tepid even in the middle class for FMCG products.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been some little bump up during the Diwali season, Dashera season, but that's already gone back. And the bottom line is that the vast majority of those who are in rural areas, they don't have the spare cash to spend for the reasons that I was explaining earlier.
Absolutely.
So the government is, in some ways the government doesn't care, because what it has decided is that we will win elections by hook or by crook. We saw what happened in the Lok Sabha elections itself. Then we've seen the same thing repeated in Haryana. Now we are going to get a repeat of that in Maharashtra and in Jharkhand. And on the entire preparation is for that, because so they know that they are likely to lose in the absence of manipulation.
No,
It's
but
become so clear.
right. But I want to stick on to the topic of inflation. So my
Yeah,
last question
yeah.
to you is that how soon can we expect a meaningful relief? Can the people really look
No,
forward
we
to the
cannot.
days when there will be some relief?
No, no. It's only when some fortuitous events happen that you will have some relief. Because A, this government is not going to give any relief in trying to enable jobs to be created. B, it's not going to cut taxes on petrol and diesel, which is the direct and simplest way of actually cutting inflation rates. So what are we left with? We're not left with very much. Uh, it's because the inflation rate is high, the repo rate is going to remain high, and ordinary borrowers who were earlier taking retail loans to keep in consumption up, the RBI said no, 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 banks should stop giving out retail loans. They are giving out too many retail loans because the people may not be able to return, and we know this that the microfinance institutions, they are not getting their money back. They
Right.
had lent to people, and their money was not coming back to them. Why? Because people are barely managing, especially in rural areas.
But Mr. Mehrotra, the big question which everyone wants to know and the answer for is that if this is the kind of inflation we are seeing, you are saying that there is no relief uh, anytime in future. So where will the Indian rupee stand? Maybe say in the next 2 years. We are already at 84 as
There
compared to
will
the
be
dollar.
some, yeah, yeah.
So
So there will be some, there will certainly be a certain degree of depreciation. I can tell you this, that depreciation of the rupee might not be such a bad thing in the first place. One, because it will mean that our imports will be more expensive, so imports can come down. Two, our exports will increase because our exports will be cheaper for the foreign buyer. And it is true that one of the reasons why our merchandise goods exports have not been doing too well, which is the reason why our jobs have not been doing so well. The rupee's value against the dollar is connected to our national pride, to how strong a nation is. That's a very silly way of thinking about the rupee or the national currency, because what that kind of thinking forgets is that the Chinese maintained massive export surpluses on the strength of a depreciated renminbi. They kept it, and why do you think we did? Our exports were doing so well for nearly 20 years until 2014. Imports are cheaper, and so imports have been flooding in. So the government tries to correct that by imposing tariffs, which again raises our costs.
right,
The tariffs raise costs for those who are importing to produce within the country. It's
right.
a bizarre situation where you say the economists are not thinking or the government is not listening.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Mehrotra, for throwing so much of light on this persistent inflation, which is really worrying all the people. And you are saying that there is no relief in sight anytime in future. So we'll have to wait and watch how the government tries to manage. And right now, all focus is on the elections. So we'll have to wait and watch what the government does really for the common man, which is struggling with rising prices of pulses, vegetables, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much, Mr. Mehrotra, for joining on the Federal. And one appeal to the viewers who are watching this interview: subscribe to our channel, send us your feedback, and stay tuned to the Federal.